I'm Gene Preuss, and welcome to the webinar that we're putting on tonight, Preventing Violence by Assault Rifles, What Can Be Done? And this is a joint effort by the League of Women Voters of Texas, by LULAC Texas, and the NAACP. And we want to thank our co-sponsors, and we want to talk to some very special guests, including Art Acevedo, Dr. Sandra McKay, and Dr. Jeff Temple. And we'll turn to them in just a few minutes and get started. But first, let's hear a word of introduction from Joyce Bombard, the League of Women Voters Texas president.
Hi, everyone. I am Joyce Bombard, president of the League of Women Voters of Texas. The League is a grassroots, nonpartisan political organization, meaning we never support nor oppose political parties or candidates, but we do take positions on public policy issues and then advocate on those issues, positions such as gun safety. The League is pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar with our partners, the League of United Latin American Citizens of Texas and the Texas NAACP State Conference. I hope you all find this informative and will take action with us at the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Gary Bledsoe of the Texas NAACP. Gary?
Welcome, everyone, to what we feel is a very important subject matter to be discussed. We're going to need to hear all the voices around our great state if we're going to be able to make a difference. I want to say thank you to our good friends at the League of Women Voters and LULAC, and for all who agreed to participate in this event this evening. It is extremely important. When I look out at our state and understand what's been occurring over the last couple of decades, I can understand that the violence that's occurred as a result of assault rifles has really been outrageous. That indeed, it's not just Texas, but it's all around the nation. And I see our state as being under siege, where I think all people of common sense, all people of goodwill understand that there's no need for individuals in our state to possess assault rifles. But I want to add one additional thing to the discussion besides the debate, which is more difficult to accomplish about whether or not individuals should own assault rifles. I think when we look at police and we understand what occurred in Uvalde and we see what occurred in Buffalo, we see where in Buffalo there was a retired police officer, fully armed, that had a bulletproof vest on. And he was no match to a shooter with the automatic weapon. We see the police officers in Uvalde who were really called to halt, and because they were concerned with the weaponry that the shooter had in Uvalde. If we're going to support law enforcement, we have to take the position that we've got to come together and take these weapons out of the hands of individuals around our state and around our nation, because it's got to be done nationwide before it can be successful. One final point on this that I want to mention, because I think one of the discussions is, what can we do? You know, when we look at the federal laws in reference to guns, it's easier to get an assault weapon than it is to purchase a silencer or to get a gun that has a sawed-off shotgun barrel. That's what our good friend Lonzo Kerr, former police officer who works for the NAACP, tells us. We've researched that and we understand that. That's truly absurd. But we can come together and propose additional common sense solutions like that so we can stop the bloodshed. This is not a left-wing issue. This is not a right-wing issue. This is a Texas issue. This is an American issue. And we need to come together and work together before we can make a difference, because it's not going to be accomplished with one group or one area of our state working alone. We've got to come together, Democrats, Republicans, black, white, brown, all of us, to try and make a difference. So I'm glad that all of you have chimed in tonight, because I think it's going to be a very important conversation. And we look forward to working with all of you to help take our state back and make it safe again for all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Rudy Rosales, who is the president of Texas LULAC.
State director, but thank you. I guess the thing that I want to get across to everyone is the narrative in reference to good men with guns stop bad men with guns was proven absolutely and entirely inaccurate and deadly. So we've got to jump on that, I think, in terms of organizations and all of us. And we need to keep our eye on the prize in the sense that right now, the reality is that the narrative in reference to good guys with guns can stop bad guys with guns. Let's be honest. We saw the video. We saw up to 77 minutes, give or take, in which there were several trained law enforcement officers who were literally scared to take on the one shooter, a deranged 18-year-old with a semi-automatic weapon. So what does that tell us, and what does that say to how we can discuss this in a intelligent and articulate manner, and to explain to people that AR-15s do not belong on the streets of any city, and especially in any small town. Now, I want to stop short of criticizing law enforcement in reference to the response. I'll leave that for history. But what I do want to say is that we have to make sure that this isn't just about mental illness. This isn't just about good men with guns stopping bad men with guns. This is about the safety of our children in schools. This is about the safety of just the general public at large, at a mall, at a grocery store, at the post office, at a 4th of July parade, for crying out loud. So I think that the most important thing for us to realize at this point is that while we have to be sensitive to what the families are going through in Uvalde, we also have to make sure that we keep the narrative beyond just that people need mental health. Now, that being said, we do need to focus on mental health issues, obviously, but the most important part that I think that we have to address is that when we had a ban on assault weapons, all right, it went down significantly in terms of the percentage of shootings in this country. When that ban was lifted, it went up almost 70-some%. So if we can drive that home, I think that we can take the high road on this and make sure that we continue the narrative that we don't need assault weapons on the streets of America, period.
Thank you, Mr. Rosales. So for the next hour and 15 minutes, we're going to be talking with several panelists about gun violence here in Texas, in our local communities, and in the United States at large. Before we get started, I want to address two things. One, if you have questions for us, there is a question and answer feature on Zoom, and we'll be monitoring that, and you can ask questions by posting them through the Zoom question and answer portal. The other thing that I want to start by doing is by showing a brief video. We had wanted to ask Dr. Guerrero, who is a pediatrician at Uvalde Memorial Hospital, but he was not able to make it tonight. And what we have, however, is a video clip of testimony, a brief testimony that he gave recently in Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to show that, and then we'll come back to our guests for some questions and answers and responses.
My name is Dr. Roy Guerrero. I'm a board-certified pediatrician and was present at Uvalde Memorial Hospital the day of the massacre on May 24th, 2022 at Robb Elementary School. I was called here today as a witness, but I showed up because I am a doctor. Because how many years ago I swore an oath An oath to do no harm. After witnessing firsthand the carnage in my hometown of Uvalde, to stay silent would have betrayed that oath. Inaction is harm. Passivity is harm. Delay is harm. So here I am, not to plead, not to beg or convince you of anything, but to do my job, and hope that by doing so, it inspires the members of this House to do theirs. I've lived in Uvalde my whole life. In fact, I attended Robb Elementary School myself as a kid. As often is the case with us grown-ups, we remember a lot of the good and not so much of the bad. So I don't recall homework or detention. I remember how much I loved going to school. What a joyful time it was. Back then, we were able to run between classrooms with ease to visit our friends. And I remember the way the cafeteria smelled at lunchtime on hamburger Thursdays. It was right around lunchtime on a Tuesday that gunman entered the school through a main door without restriction, massacred 19 students and 2 teachers, and changed the way that every student at Robb and their families remember that school forever. I doubt they'll remember the smell of the cafeteria or the laughter ringing in the hallways. Instead, they'll be haunted by the memory of screams and bloodshed, panic and chaos, police shouting, parents wailing. I know I will never forget what I saw that day. For me, that day started like any typical Tuesday in our pediatric clinic. Moms calling for coughs, boogers, sports physicals, right before the summer rush. School was out in 2 days. Then summer camps would guarantee some grazes and ankle sprains, injuries that could be patched up and fixed with a Mickey Mouse sticker as a reward. Then at 12:30, business as usual stopped, and with it, my heart. A colleague from a San Antonio trauma center texted me and said, "Why are pediatric surgeons and anesthesiologists on call for a mass shooting in Uvalde?" I raced to the hospital to find parents outside yelling children's names in desperation and sobbing as they begged for any news related to their child. Those mothers' cries I will never get out of my head. As I entered the chaos of the ER, the first casualty I came across was Mia Cerrillo. She was sitting in the hallway. Her face was still clearly in shock, but her whole body was shaking from the adrenaline coursing through it. The white Lilo and Stitch shirt that she wore was covered in blood, and her shoulder was bleeding from a shrapnel injury. Sweet Mia, I've known her my whole life. As a baby, she survived major liver surgeries against all odds. And once again, she's here as a survivor, inspiring us with her story today and her bravery. When I saw Mia sitting there, I remembered having seen her parents outside. So after quickly examining 2 other patients of mine in the hallway with minor injuries, I raced outside to let them know that Mia was alive. I wasn't ready for their next urgent and desperate question. Where's Elena? Elena is Mia's 8-year-old sister, who was also at Robb at the time of the shooting. I had heard from some of the nurses that there were 2 dead children who had been moved to the surgical area of the hospital. As I made my way there, I prayed that I wouldn't find her. I didn't find Elena. But what I did find was something no prayer will ever relieve. 2 children whose bodies had been pulverized by bullets fired at them, decapitated, whose flesh had been ripped apart, that the only clue as their identities was a blood-splattered cartoon clothes still clinging to them, clinging for life and finding none. I could only hope these 2 bodies were a tragic exception to the list of survivors. But as I waited there with my fellow Uvalde doctors, nurses, first responders, and hospital staff for other casualties we hope to save, they never arrived. All that remained was the bodies of 17 more children and the 2 teachers who cared for them, who dedicated their careers to nurturing and respecting the awesome potential of every single one, just as we doctors do. I'll tell you why I became a pediatrician, because I knew that children were the best patients. They accept the situation as it's explained to them. You don't have to coax them into changing their lifestyles in order to get better or plead them to modify their behavior as you do with adults. No matter how hard you try to help an adult, their path to healing is always determined by how willing they are to take action. Adults are stubborn. We're resistant to change, even when the change will make things better for ourselves, but especially when we think we're immune to the fallout. Why else would there have been such little progress made in Congress to stop gun violence? Innocent children all over the country today are dead because laws and policy allows people to buy weapons before they're legally old enough to even buy a pack of beer. They're dead because restrictions have been allowed to lapse. They're dead because there are no rules about where guns are kept, because no one is paying attention to who is buying them. The thing I can't figure out is whether our politicians are failing us out of stubbornness, passivity, or both. I said before that as grown-ups, we have a convenient habit of remembering the good and forgetting the bad. Never more so than when it comes to our guns. Once the blood is rinsed away from the bodies of our loved ones and scrubbed off the floors of the schools and supermarkets and churches, the carnage from each scene is erased from our collective conscience, and we return again to nostalgia, to the rose-tinted view of our Second Amendment as a perfect instrument of American life, no matter how many lives are lost. I chose to be a pediatrician. I chose to take care of children. Keeping them safe from preventable diseases, I can do. Keeping them safe from bacteria and brittle bones, I can do. But making sure our children are safe from guns, that's the job of our politicians and leaders. In this case, you are the doctors, and our country is the patient. We are lying on the operating table, riddled with bullets like the children of Robb Elementary and so many other schools. We are bleeding out, and you are not there. My oath as a doctor means that I signed up to save lives. I do my job. And I guess it turns out that I am here to plead, to beg, to please, please do yours.
So I should mention that this webinar tonight will contain other information and other discussions of a graphic nature and violence caused by assault rifles. The description and the discussion may be graphic. I would also like to remind you what Joyce said a minute ago. This is a nonpartisan event. The League of Women Voters never supports or opposes political parties or political candidates. This is an informational webinar to learn more about some of the problems we in our communities are facing on a regular basis and news that is affecting loved ones, friends, and people we know. So to begin the discussion, we're going to turn to our panelists, and I'll introduce them briefly before we let them start. First, Dr. Jeff Temple. Dr. Temple is the founding director of the Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Texas Medical Branch. He's a licensed psychologist, a professor, as I said, and vice dean for research and scholarship for the School of Nursing at the UTMB Medical Branch in Galveston, where he holds the John Seeley Distinguished Chair in Community Health. Dr. Temple.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Preuss. I appreciate it, and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Would you like to make any opening comments or response to what you just heard from Dr. Guerrero?
You know, it was tough to listen to Dr. Guerrero. I'll say that. I'm also going to piggyback on the League of Women Voters nonpartisan stance. And I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist. And one of the things that we'll talk about when we do talk about some of the research and the science behind mass shootings and school shootings and the AR-15s is that, and this might not be too surprising to anyone, but the AR-15s are dangerous and are responsible for a substantial majority of our recent mass shootings, over half of our most lethal mass shootings, and that was prior to Uvalde and Buffalo and the July 4th mass shooting. So just to say that I'm approaching this from a scientific perspective, and what the research shows us is that it's one, access to guns, and two, access to guns that are meant for war.
Dr. Temple, what are the characteristics of people who commit these crimes? And we're seeing more and more of them, and we understand that there is, the FBI profilers have identified certain characteristics. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, outside of being male, typically white, and mostly under the age of 21, there really isn't a great profile of mass shooters. And that's a lot of what the federal government has come up with. You know, there was a study, their study of school shooters found that attackers actually varied considerably in terms of demographic background and other characteristics. You know, some were from intact families, some were from the foster care system. Some of the attackers had numerous ties to the community, and others, were more just loners, are described as loners. Some came from two-parent families. Some had excellent grades. Some had failing grades. Some their grades actually improved right before the mass shooting, whereas others started to become worse. Some were socially isolated. Some were described as loners. Some were popular among their peers. Some had no observed behavioral problems, and others had multiple behavioral problems. So basically what I'm saying there is there's really not a really great profile. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today, and I'll hold off until later on in this hour, but is that prevention needs to be universal and promote overall health and strength. I will say that some additional characteristics that have shown is that, and I want to preface this with, there's no one predictor. There's no one, magic bullet that we could say, if we tackle this issue, if we get more kids, in two-parent households, that's the key. There's just nothing like that. There's no single thing outside of it being a male and typically a white and typically under 21. There are some characteristics that are more prevalent among shooters than others, is that there is some sense of bullying, especially when it's being emasculated, feeling persecuted or injured prior to the attack. Most of the attackers had some sort of difficulty before the attack, so a significant loss, a personal failure, death of a loved one. There's been a lot of attempted suicide or considering of suicide in attackers, and of course, interest in guns and other weapons. An often overlooked predictor of mass shootings and sort of that everyday gun violence is misogyny and hatred of women and domestic violence. So even if you look at just mass shootings, over half of mass shooters have a history of family violence, whether it was exposed to parent-to-parent violence or them themselves being violent toward intimate partners. So we know that's there. We also know with increasing frequency with recent mass shootings is xenophobia and hatred of people that don't look like them. So we saw that with Buffalo and El Paso. And then I just want to take a brief mention to say one thing that it really is not, and I appreciated Director Rosales talking about this at the beginning, is mental illness. We know that mental illness is actually, and if you look at mass shooters, it's a minority had diagnosable mental illness. And in fact, I'll go beyond that and say that mental illness, there is not a diagnosable mental illness that explains mass shooting. It just isn't. No matter what diagnosis you have, that does not explain why someone is a mass shooter. And in fact, people who are mentally ill are way more likely to be victims of gun violence than perpetrators. And it's really, really important. So, while I'm a psychologist and I love the fact that we're getting billions of dollars to bolster our nation's response to mental health needs, that's great. I love it. I'm not going to complain, but it's not going to do anything at all to curb mass shootings. It'll help with suicides. It'll help some with gun violence, but it's not going to do much to have anything to do with mass shootings, because we know that mental illness itself is not really related to mass shootings. And so we're depriving people with mental illness of their Second Amendment rights, and we're further stigmatizing mental illness. So people are less likely to seek help, worried that they're going to be prevented from owning guns. So it's going to make the problem worse, not better. All that to say, it's not video games. It's not, rap music. It's not violent TV or movies. All of our peer countries have that. Every single one of them have it, even some to more degree. What they don't have is access to guns, and especially access to these assault rifles.
Dr. Temple, so you're trying to say that it's more than a simple solution. But I would ask a question is, and maybe this is pop psychology or stuff we see on television. Could we not say that people who do this, or at least maybe have some psychopathic behavior, or is that even a real diagnosis?
Now, I'm glad you asked that, because it does, the question is, well, that person had to be crazy. Well, how do you know they're crazy? Well, because they did this. And you know what? Yes, absolutely. A well-adjusted person does not perpetrate mass shooting in schools or in churches or parades. That just doesn't happen. So when I say it's not mental illness, I mean something sort of diagnosable, things that we think of like depression and bipolar and even schizophrenia. Those things don't make us violent. What it is someone who is not well adjusted, someone who has a lot of hostility and impulsivity and hatred of whether it's women or people who aren't white. So that seems to be a big predictor. And again, what we talked about earlier is this recent loss or recent failure that seems to be a predictor of mass shootings. But so I don't want to say that, I don't want to throw the baby out the bathwater in that sense, but it is more an issue of mental wellness, a lack of mental wellness as opposed to mental illness, which is really, really important because if you look at these mass shooters, again, a lot of them came from intact families. They were popular. They weren't picked on someone that was bad, quote unquote bad. And so if we do all this stuff, if we do things like increasing mental health care in schools, which is great and we need it, it's just not going to do a lot to stop mass shootings.
Well, let me not put you on the spot here, but it seems like we're seeing this happen all the time now. I can't, as I mentioned at the opening, I almost can't turn on the TV or the radio without hearing about a mass shooting or a shooting incident happening somewhere in my hometown, the area that I live in, the state, or the nation. And a lot of people are getting quite upset about this. And what are the statistics? What are the numbers? And I'll also ask the other guests this too, but what can you provide us on to how, is this just something that we're more aware of now and has always been going on, or are we seeing an uptick?
We're definitely seeing an uptick. It's increasing. Columbine was sort of the turning point. That was in the late 90s. And since then we saw what researchers have called a sort of slow riot that keeps on escalating and increasing. We did, as one of the guests originally, we did see a decrease between 1994 and 2004 in mass shootings relative to the decade before and since 2004. And that was because assault rifles were banned. When that was released in 2004, when it was let to expire, the ban on assault rifles, that's when you start to see the increase in mass shootings. And it seems to be increasing not only since then, but increasing at a faster rate. So your observation that seems to be happening more and more is accurate. It is happening more frequently, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'll say with what can, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit later on. Even if we were to ban assault weapons today, there are roughly 400 million guns in America, more than one per American. Many of those are assault rifles, and so it's going to take generations to get rid of assault rifles in this country. So you'll hear me preach, prevention, that we have to make happier and healthier people since these guns are there, and we're not going to do anything about them for generations. And it's going to take generational investments, millions, billions of dollars, like we've done with COVID and HIV and cancer, to address this public health crisis.
Right, thank you. Next, we turn to Police Chief Art Acevedo. Art Acevedo is from California and started off in the California Highway Patrol. I'm guessing he was influenced by the TV show Chips, like I was. And he eventually moved up the ranks. In 2005, he was promoted to chief. In 2007, he came to Austin, was chief of police in Austin, where he served for nearly a decade. And then in 2016, he came to Houston and was chief of police. In 2021, he went to Florida and was chief in Miami. And Chief Acevedo, what can you respond to some of the questions and some of the discussion we've been having? Why are we seeing more problems with gun violence? You're muted, Chief.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you all for being on. Thank you especially to the 248 attendees. You know, gun violence is a problem that is multifaceted. You have to separate the type of gun violence we're talking about and the response to it. You know, you have to talk about suicides, as Dr. Temple mentioned. You have to talk about mass violence that we're really talking about, mass shootings that we're talking about tonight, which I think are the focus of this. You also have to talk about accidental shootings, and you have to talk also about daily shootings in our country from just daily gun violence. So for every mass shooting we have, they are going up. We just have more victims from just daily shootings. We have, I think, upwards of 40,000 people in this country die from some type of firearm wound, whether it's self-inflicted, mass shooting, daily shooting, and so forth. And so for me, it's a matter of the more firearms you have in society, as the number of firearms go up, you have more opportunities for things to go sideways. And on top of that, when you look at the data that Dr. Temple talked about, that most of your, the vast majority of your mass shooters are usually young white males. Most of these shooters are going to be under the age of 25. Quite honestly, most of them are under the age of 21. And in too many places in our country, this at-risk population where they're coming from, they can very easily get these weapons. It's a problem. If you look at Buffalo, and then you look at right shortly after Buffalo, Uvalde, we have young men that were able to get firearms that can't go buy beer, that can't even get pistols, but somehow can go out and get high capacity, very powerful weapons that are really designed not to hunt animals, but to really kill a large number of people in a short period of time. And so I really believe that we can have an impact, and Major Cities Chiefs Association that I was able to lead for 3 years. And I was on the actual board for nearly 15 years, 14 and a half years to be exact. You know, we've been calling for an assault weapons ban. I'm a realist. I don't think that's going to happen in this country. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was the first, real federal legislation since, I think, 1994. I don't remember exactly when the assault weapons ban was instituted, but it's been decades since we've had something. The chances of an outright ban is pretty, it's slim to none right now. But I think that if we simply raised it to 21 and be consistent, if you have to wait to 21 to get a pistol, you certainly should have to wait to 21 to get an assault rifle. We believe, a lot of law enforcement, that if we limited magazine capacity to 10 or less instead of your 30 round clips, or think about Ohio, where a gentleman went down right after we had El Paso. He had a 100 round drum, right, that he had attached to this assault rifle, and he was getting ready to enter a nightclub, a bar in Dayton, Ohio, when he's actually taken out, thankfully, by an officer with his patrol rifle. So there's a myriad of things we can do. I'm grateful. I think we all should be that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed, but that's just a starting point. It's not going to end gun violence in terms of the mass shootings that we're seeing, but it will reduce them. And for those in the Congress that would say there's not a single example of a law that has stopped that would have stopped all these mass shootings. Well, we know that these two under 21 in Buffalo and in Uvalde wouldn't have been able to legally purchase firearms, especially the one in Uvalde that went straight after his 18th birthday, bought an AR-15, bought high capacity magazines, and then bought hundreds of rounds, and within days went and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. So there are things we can do, but until the American people make this their number one issue, or one of their top issues when they vote, regardless of political affiliation. Gun safety, and make it an issue that they need to hold politicians accountable for. I have a feeling we'll be having these type of webinars for generations to come.
Well, that's an unfortunate statement, but I appreciate your sentiment. I've got a couple of questions for you. As somebody who's a police officer, you deal with weapons, you're trained in weapons. A couple of things that are often said about AR weapons is that, you know, they're really essentially a 22. And I'm going to show a picture here, right? This is a 22, and this is like your grandpa's little 22 on the left, the image on the left, right? And kids use it and taught with small little rifles or little guns. Some people have 22s, and we don't think it's a very, you know, people say it's a step up from a BB. On the other side is a 5.56. This is one of the bullets you can use in an AR type weapon. And people say, well, look, it's the same diameter. It's essentially the same. But when we look at the diameter of the bullet, maybe, but certainly whenever we look at the energy behind the bullet, it's a little bit different. Can you tell us about the difference between these two types of bullets and the guns that are behind them?
Well, I think that when you look at the longer bullet in the right, it's the amount of damage that it actually does. It is designed to for maximum. There's a reason it's similar to the ammunition that the military uses. It's designed to kill. It's not. It's designed to create the most damage possible. And there's a reason most people don't go hunting for deer meat using AR-15s. They might go kill hogs with it, but they may not. They and coyotes, but they're not going to go hunt something they're going to eat. The second piece that I think is different is not just the ammunition. It's the capacity to attach magazines that hold many more rounds. When you go hunting with your typical rifle, you may have a bolt action, or you may have just a handful of rounds in that firearm, but you're not going to have 30 round clips, 20 round clips, or God forbid, 100 round drums. And so I think those are what distinguishes them from each other. And so again, you can defend your home with a revolver and a shotgun just as easily as I think I would argue in terms of the house, you're not going to overpenetrate with a shotgun and shoot your neighbor or your neighbor halfway down the street when you go from sheetrock to sheetrock, from house to house, right through these walls. So for self-defense, I don't think the AR-15 type weapon is really the best weapon. But if it's a weapon you're looking for to be able to kill as many people as you can in the short amount of time, that's really what, to me, is the biggest, what distinguishes these weapon systems from one another. And if you look at those officers, and somebody said they weren't going to criticize the cops, but I think I will. They did not do what they're supposed to do. And what is most, besides the fact that we lost all these children, what is really angering me even more, just as much, is that no one's really talking about the shooter, and no one's talking about the fact that why is it that an 18-year-old who has these thoughts of committing mass violence was able, right after his 18th birthday, to go in, buy that weapon, and go out and kill a bunch of people, especially when the data shows. And Doc, I know that what you said about mental health, but the data does show that when people are going to be triggered, I think the data shows most of them it's going to manifest itself in these type of events before they reach the age of 21 and most certainly 25. Not to mention the fact that some of the research that I've done shows that the brain's not even fully developed till you're 25. And so we're not talking about what those cops were so afraid of was the fact that they knew they were dealing with a high-powered assault rifle with the capacity that put down a lot of rounds down range, and that created even greater fear. And so the good guys with the gun hesitated for an hour and 17 minutes because they knew the capacity, they knew the lethality of the weapon they were facing. And unfortunately, that caused them to hesitate, and I think we lost lives. And so we need to talk about that too, right? We need to talk about the poor police response, the abysmal police response, but we also need to not lose focus of those cops that have been facing an AR-15 in the first place from an 18-year-old that was able to just go in and pay the money and go get this weapon of mass destruction, if you will.
Chief Acevedo, let me ask you a question since you're bringing up the training. So maybe this is a perspective from someone who's watched a lot of TV, watched a lot of police procedural shows, and watched a lot of movies, but we have this impression that the good guys' aim is always true and they're always rushing in, and the bad guys have bad aim and will always miss and are cowardly. And some people are talking about all the training the police have had, the police in the Uvalde shooting and others have had, is that they've been to the FBI, they've been to DPS training, but all that training, it doesn't help if you don't apply it, right? So what is the way that officers are trained to deal in these situations?
Well, look, when you have an active shooter, which was the case in Uvalde, after Columbine, we went from contain, surround, contain, and wait for special weapons team to nope, we attack, advance. You have gunshots, you hear gunfire, you run towards the gunfire. And it evolved from the first 4 move in to now we even have solo officer response, where the training, the expectation is when there's an active shooter, even that first arriving officer is to run towards the gunfire, identify the source of the gunfire, and actually take on whoever's responsible for the gunfire. And that simply did not happen here. When you see, and if you all saw the video yesterday that's now making the rounds through the media, what we're not hearing is the sound. We know that more gunshots were being fired by that suspect during that hour and 17 minutes. And I think the day that the public potentially hears gunfire, sporadic gunfire by the suspect and children screaming, and I think the day that the public hears the 911 calls coming in from those classrooms and the police standing out there in that hallway, and potentially another 100 cops even outside the school, there's going to be even more outrage. So understanding that the good guys with the guns did not get the job done here the way they were supposed to do it. Quite honestly, when you look at police training, when you have staffing shortages across the country, they're not going to train in that tactic as often as they should, or any other tactic, because they just don't have the bandwidth to take people offline on a regular basis. So when we understand that, it makes it even more important to prevent and disrupt these type of events from happening in the first place, which means we need to have a really robust conversation about whether or not 18-year-olds should go in and buy a weapon of war. And I don't want to hear this, well, you're old enough when you go in the military. Well, the difference is that in the military, you go through a selection process, you go through psychological evaluation, you go through extensive training, you have a very, very close supervision. And by the way, your M4 or your firearms get checked out on the day of training, during the training, and when you're done with training, guess what they do with those firearms? They lock them back up in the armory. So it's a highly controlled environment. It's a safe environment, secure environment with high supervision. And so I think that more than ever, we need to start having conversations about if we have limited purchasing pistols, handguns to 21, it just makes sense to me. Why aren't we doing the same thing for AR-15s, AK-47s, and other high capacity, high caliber, very lethal firearms like these? I think we owe it to society, and we owe it to young people that may end up being in crisis and these crazy things. not crazy. I don't want Dr. Temple to chew me out. But these things that you can't explain, where they snap. I mean, the human mind is a fragile thing, and people snap on a regular basis. And by the way, rather than doing the things I'm doing now in Texas, we're making it easier and easier. Now we have permitless carry, where you can open carry that AR-15, and guess what? You can do it legally, and the police can't do a damn thing until the person's approaching that school, and then that's a little bit too late. It is not normal behavior walk around with an AR-15 in downtown Houston or downtown Austin or downtown Dallas. And I think God gave us common sense, and we as individuals use it, and we need to start demanding that our elected officials use it before more blood is spilled in our schools, in our churches, in our theaters, in our supermarkets, and on our streets.
Thank you, Chief. Let me turn to Sandra McKay. Dr. McKay is an associate professor of pediatrics with the McGovern School, the McGovern Medical School and UTHealth Houston, and is a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. She's a pediatrician and has focused on child health advocacy and works for the Center for Health and Biosciences at the Baker Institute. Dr. McKay, what is your response to that moving presentation that Dr. Guerrero made at the beginning of the webinar?
You know, as a pediatrician, it breaks your heart to hear that, because you take care of children every day, and your goal as a pediatrician is to keep children safe and healthy. And you don't want children to be in a situation where they have fear or where they, are in danger, and you send them to school in a situation where they are to be protected and safe. And that clearly didn't happen for them that day. And, to be in a situation where children were unsafe and where they were not protected was just heartbreaking to hear as a pediatrician. And on top of that, to feel like this was something that was predictable and preventable was even more frustrating as a pediatrician, because gun violence is predictable, it is preventable. And we can do better, and we should do better. Here in Texas, when you look at the top 10 deadliest mass shootings in America, Texas makes the list 5 times. So it's not something that we should overlook. We should be looking at what is going on here in Texas. Why did we make the list 5 times? And that happened over a span of decades. The first time we made the list was in 1966 with the Texas Austin tower shootings, and most recently with Uvalde. So, this is a problem that Texas has faced for decades, and it is a problem that we must address and be aggressive with, because we must do better for our patients, for our children, and for our citizens. It's imperative that we continue to address this.
You've been an advocate for better responsibility. I've talked to you last year in another venue about practicing gun safety. What do you tell families and children who are seemingly the number one victims of gun violence, death by gun violence in the United States? What is your advice to them?
Yeah. So what we've seen over the last few years is motor vehicle accidents are no longer the leading cause of death in children. It's firearm injury. Okay. And that's something that should be shocking to Americans. It's something that we need to step up for, right? Children, their leading cause of death is not cancer. It is not infection. It is not motor vehicle accidents. It is firearm injury, right? And so we need to be taking action on this. And so some of the things that we talk to our parents about is, first of all, if you're a firearm owner, that you need to be a responsible firearm owner. Your firearms need to be stored safely and securely, right? Every single firearm in your home needs to be locked up. Every single one, whether it's your shotgun needs to be stored in a safe, or if you have a firearm that's in a nightstand for personal protection, there's no reason it cannot be in a biometric safe for your quick access. Even if you need quick access, that's fine. It still needs to be locked up. right? Because that quick access per 2 seconds in a biometric safe, it's no faster than how you use your, access your phone. So you need to make sure that every firearm in your home is safely secured. Secondly, you need to also make sure that your children are talked to about what to do if they see a firearm, because children are impulsive, they're curious, and if they go to a home that maybe isn't as secure as yours, they may want to see a firearm and play with it. It's super common that children think everything are toys. They're impulsive, they're curious, and it's a parent's responsibility to also take that conversation to the next level and to actively engage other parents in that conversation. We need to normalize this conversation in America. It is not a taboo topic. We should do that as normal as what you would say with, my kid doesn't know how to swim. Do you have a pool in your backyard? My child has a peanut allergy. So make sure that they're, you're paying attention to what they're exposed to in their food. And, oh, how are your firearms stored in your home? So that way, my child thinks everything's a toy. Make sure that your firearms are locked up. We've got to normalize this conversation and make each other accountable for how we store our firearms. And then if there's someone in the home that's struggling, we know that our teenagers especially are dealing with a mental health crisis in America. The AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, declared a mental health emergency for our adolescent population. We know that they're struggling. We know that COVID did not help with this situation. What we need to do is identify patients that are struggling and give them alternatives in their storage situations. You may need to take that firearm out of your home for a temporary amount of time. We need to make sure that they have a safe option to remove those firearms out of their homes, partner with our community agencies to make sure that families can really feel safe.
Dr. McKay, I've got some questions, and I'm going to actually open it up to the whole panel. And I've got some questions that got to cross individual lines. I also want to bring your attention to the panelists with me tonight, that there is a Q&A session, and we can read the Q&A questions, and also those that we might miss, we have some people monitoring them. I'm looking briefly at some of the Q&As, and some of these have been addressed already. So I'm not picking them in any particular order because of anybody that I know, not playing favoritisms, but I think there's several good questions up here that I'm seeing right now, and I'm going to continue to look. If you see any, the panelists that you'd like to address, feel free. Chief Acevedo, you said something that somebody asked a question about. Why can't we make it illegal to own assault weapons? Is the cat just out of the bag? Dr. Temple was talking about how many millions of guns are out there per person. Per capita guns are tremendous. Why don't we just say that it's illegal to ban assault weapons?
It's just a political reality that we're living in. Unfortunately, we live in a time where there are too many safe districts in this country, especially in Texas, let's face it. And politicians are going to make their decisions based on the impact on their primary race. That is the prism they look through public policy, not on what's good for the people, not on what's good for public safety. And until voters start making this their litmus test, and voters make this kind of like the pro-life movement made it their #1 issue and did whatever it took politically to actually get what they want, it will never happen, not in this current environment. So in Texas, you can vote in any primary you want. And I think that people need to start getting more strategic and to what primaries they're voting in and making sure that whatever their #1 issue is, vote in the primary where you're going to have the greatest impact on the political views and actions of elected officials. And I think if we did that in large enough numbers, you might start getting some common sense folks that would like to support some of these things, but won't because they know that the consequences they'll be out. Look at John Cornyn, what his numbers looked like after he supported the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. You don't think that the rest of them are watching that. It's just the reality of what we're facing right now. And so it's up to the voters. We've got to get smart.
Yeah.
Dr. McKay?
Yeah, I agree that it's something that's got to go to the voters. When you look at the policies around this, I mean, we had the assault weapons ban that was in place for 10 years and it was not renewed when it came up for renewal. And it's interesting that there's not been an opportunity, like they've had opportunities to renew it and it's never really been renewed in there. This is a state's issue is where this has got to go to. It's not going to end up being a federal issue. And so, you know, the palatability in here is not necessarily an all out ban. I think where you've got to look to this is when we've seen success in other areas has been when you can take incremental bites into things. So you're not going to get the whole pie coming right out of this, right? And I think the success that you saw with the bipartisan act was like a little piece of it. And I think the problem that we've had, especially when it comes to a policy perspective, is the deadlock has really been a lot of people wanting all of their asks and not necessarily being willing to compromise and take a small piece of that ask and then keep coming back to the table for more. And so I think we were able to make a little bit of a win with this bipartisan act because there was some enhanced background checks from the 18 to 21 age range. So that was a positive because at least it gives 10 more days on that background check ask where they have to do a little bit more enhanced. It's not the golden goose. It's not everything that we wanted here, but it did give us a little bit more there and it gives us an opportunity to go back and to continue to push, but it's got to be pushed at the state level. And what we see from the 2A is from Second Amendment clearly states that, you know, there is the right to bear arms, but it very clearly states that the states have the right to regulate it. And so this really was kicked very clearly to the states and each state has the right to regulate. And Texas has been not the best at putting in, you know, strict regulations on firearms, but they do ban things like machine guns. So there are some things that the state is willing to put in there. We do have that purchase age of 21 on handguns. We have to demonstrate to our decision makers what the people of Texas want, but it's got to be not just from the people that are here on this webinar. It's got to be from all stakeholders from across all areas, right? So it's got to be Republicans, Democrats, it's got to be firearm owners, it's got to be FFLs, it's got to be the people who sell the firearms as well. It's got to be a unified approach. It's got to really be a consensus that's here to demonstrate that it's palatable, it's wanted. So it's really going to take a very unified approach in order to see this, and it's going to take time. And it's going to take a lot of grassroots efforts here.
And I just want a couple of points on what Dr. McKay said. I want the audience to really hear one of the things she said. You cannot buy a handgun if you're under 21, but you can buy an assault rifle if you're under 21. It's stupid. And there's no better way to say that. Secondly, and on a more positive note, I don't think, you know, with the recent legislation, we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. This legislation will absolutely save lives. You know, the boyfriend loophole, which basically for folks that are dating and not married, that if they have a history of dating violence, now they are prohibited from purchasing a gun if they're convicted. So there's some really good things about this recent legislation that is going to save lives. So again, you know, it's not, we have made some progress.
Someone asks a very good question to kind of follow up on what you're saying, Dr. Temple. In rural areas, I grew up in Central Texas, just northeast of San Antonio. And it was when I was going to school in the 80s, 1980s, it was not uncommon to see people with shotguns or rifles, especially around deer season, in the back of their pickup trucks. And this was on our high school campus. And that began changing in the mid 80s, but everybody had a gun and AR style guns. And let's not just limit the conversation to ARs, because there's other types of assault weapons. It's not uncommon to lump those together, and people say, well, you know, it's I need those rifles for hunting. What about hogs, as the chief was saying, in rural areas? You know, maybe not for me, but to protect yourself against hogs. So maybe is the problem that we lump those, you know, it's pistols and it's old guns, which are completely different, and black powder guns, and then every other gun that's long is kind of seen as a group. And And maybe there needs to be more distinction.
I think that's a great point. Now, a couple points to that. One is some of our rural folks, maybe they need to be better shots and don't need the huge magazines that we have. So maybe an intervention point is to, if we can't get rid of the AR-15s or the high magazine assault rifles, maybe we reduce the size of the magazines. You saw with Las Vegas, I think an important point that's often missed is 50 people were killed right around there, and 500 people were injured in the Las Vegas shooting. You can't do that with other types of guns. You just can't. And so, I guess I feel sympathetic toward people with hogs, but I care more about people. And if this is a sticking point, then let's license them. Let's tax them. Let's have a vetting process where they really, it's very hard to get one of these guns, a war gun. Let's make it very difficult.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Jeff, when we really talk about like that's magazine capacity, like, restricting magazine capacity has been demonstrated successful in other states. And so when you look at assault weapons, 7 other states currently have some restrictions on assault weapons in other states. And so we can look to other states and see what they've done as far as restricting magazine capacity to as little as 5 or 10, what type of functions that they have on their weapon. And so whether it's like the semi-automatic function versus having to do like the lever action rifle, or, how it loads, or where the magazine inserts into the firearm. So there's lots of different ways to classify these weapons, and then you can identify those ways of classification in order to restrict the sales of those, or to add additional enhancements on theirs. There are some cities that are also exploring things like liability insurance as well. So if you choose to purchase or own one of these, and then you also have to add a layer of liability insurance for yourself, similar to having like liability insurance for your car. So there's additional layers of protection that, and I think of it as a layer of protection for a firearm owner as well. You should, feel like you need to protect your firearm and for yourself. And in full disclosure, I am a firearm owner. So I think, layers of protection for my firearm is important to me, and so if you want to add extra layers of protection, making sure you have a good safe, making sure you have good laws that are in place that are going to protect you as a firearm owner and protect yourself in case there was an accident, or in case there was an injury that was unintentional. You want to make sure that there are things that are in place. Do we need to look at training? And that was one of the big things that was highly fought with the permitless carry, because people that wanted to get a permit to have their license carry had to go through this extensive training. And I really enjoyed my LTC classes, because there was a lot that you learned, especially about the laws and the regulations, and to demonstrate that you were proficient with the use of your handgun, I thought was really important. And when that was removed, I was really kind of sad for people, because you miss out on a lot of that legislation. Now, mind you, you could open carry your rifles for a long time in Texas. So you could really walk around with your long guns for a while, but it's just that open carry with your handgun now is, you could buy a handgun and just carry without knowing, the laws and the regulations around there, and even proving that you're proficient with your firearm. So I think having those layers of protection for the firearm owner is another way to frame it and think about it. And especially when you're talking to decision makers and policymakers, that's ways that we need to be thinking about for them. So it's not just about the injury prevention piece to our citizens and to our children, but it is also keeping the rights of the firearm owners protected as well.
A question that has come up, Chief, maybe you want to start off by addressing this. How do we define assault weapons? And there's been a couple of questions very similar to this on the discussion. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to just limit it to AR style weapons because as one of my friends says, well, if I can't buy an AR, I can buy an AK, or I can buy a Glock and modify it. Because a lot of weapons, what the general public doesn't realize is that an AR that you can buy publicly, for the most part, fires one shot at a time, but many weapons can be adapted fairly easily to fire rapidly. Chief, what do you think about this?
Well, you have the sears now, right? The sears that they can put into, that you can modify weapons very easily and you can make it a rapid fire. But generally speaking, the assault weapon is really about capacity in terms of the number of the ammo capacity it has and the ability to rapid fire. So when you add capacity and the ability to rapid fire, plus the distance that you have with the assault rifles in terms of being able to take out targets at a much greater distance, that's generally what you look at. I can look up real quick a legal definition, but that's generally what people are talking about in terms of assault rifles are capacity, effective range, and obviously the caliber of the weapon as well. And how many rounds you can fire in terms of the ability to fire rounds in short periods of time. That's generally.
Anyone else want to comment? All right, so let me ask another question. And I think Dr. McKay kind of brought this up. People are saying if we put in more limitations, we're going to limit and infringe upon the Second Amendment freedom to carry a gun. How can we've talked about, we should, but how do we, does anybody have any ideas on suggestions on how do we better control firearms while still allowing lawful citizens to possess them?
I'll say one thing that I'm just going to push back a little bit on the lawful citizens because everyone's a lawful citizen until they're not. And most of the guns in recent mass shootings were bought legally. So that's I'm just pushing back on that a little bit. But I do think we have to do a better job of messaging. And I think it takes gun owners like Dr. McKay, and there are some Affirm, AFFIRM in the United States. It's an organization that is made up of both gun owning and non-gun owning folks that are looking for nonpartisan change. And I think it's a lot to do with the messaging that we're not coming away. People aren't coming to take guns away. That's not the purpose. High capacity magazines, sure. Weapons of war, sure, but not coming to take all the guns away. And I think that we have to do a better job in getting folks to trust that is the accurate messaging.
Yeah, I will just say the greatest threat to gun rights is gun violence.
Yeah, I agree.
Mr. Rosales, you've had your hand up, so let me come to you. You have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, discuss the way this discussion has gone. And I have to be frank with you, I think we're asking all the wrong questions. I have to back up Chief Acevedo in saying that until we stop worrying about law-abiding citizens, until we stop worrying about interpretation of the Second Amendment, until we stop worrying about states' rights, which have always been used against minorities, this is not a states' rights issue. The Second Amendment clearly says a well-regulated militia. It does not say for individuals to own guns. So this whole definition in terms of this whole conversation that we're having shouldn't be a conversation at all. The problem is that we worry too much about law-abiding gun owners and we don't worry about the 19 children that were chopped up to pieces and decapitated. And Chief, I agree with you. Until we make it a priority and stop discussing how are we going to stop assault rifles from how are we going to deal with this? How can we put more restrictions on 21-year-olds versus 18-year-olds? There should not be assault rifles on the streets of America, period. And until we as Americans, regardless of party, start voting for people who are with us, we're going to continue to see these type of violence in our streets. And I wanted to go back to Dr. Temple, and I wanted to agree with him in terms of that's step one. The reality is, we look at these mass shootings, but we forget about the violence against women in terms of how many women are killed, domestic violence, with just a handgun. So this isn't just about assault rifles. Step one is we need to stop the discussion on whether or not how do we limit them? No, they need to be banned. We need to have the veracity, and we have to have the guts, and we have to stand up, and we have to tell our people, and if it means we lose this election and we lose the next, and we lose by 2 votes in the Senate or 1 vote in the House, we continue to fight. But we cannot continue this discussion on how do we limit, or how do we put things in terms of about law-abiding citizens, and what about the law-abiding citizens who sent their children to school in Uvalde? And I'm sorry for getting a little emotional, but I think that we are in the wrong discussion in this whole debate on whether or not there's no more debate. Assault rifles, militaristic rifles, whether you categorize, how do you change one from another, it should not be the debate. The debate should be the AR-15s need to be off the streets. Thank you.
Well, part of the problem, Mr. Rosales, and I appreciate your comments there, but and it seems that we haven't been in the habit of discussing this very much at all, and so we are going to be asking the wrong questions, because both sides, and maybe many sides in the middle, it occurs to me, oftentimes, as soon as people start talking about this very issue, there's somebody that says, you can't take away my guns, conversation ender. Or another person that says, we have to take away all guns, conversation ender. And it seems like there's a lot of ways of stopping the conversation and not letting it proceed forward. So, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that we are just not used to having this conversation, and I think that, not to put words in anybody's mouth, but that kind of seems to be what I'm hearing from some of our panelists. And so the question is how do we get more conversations, and doing what NAACP in Texas, doing what LULAC in Texas is doing to encourage these, and how do we get more of them?
Yeah, and I think kind of speaking a little bit about really understanding where the history behind all of these conversations even started, and kind of understanding where a lot of this, because even going back to Second Amendment, Second Amendment was the well-regulated militia and the right to bear arms of the people was defined in there, because when you look at the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, they made a compromise with the Second Amendment, because they gave the federal government the complete right to control the army and the militia, which was a real compromise for them, because at that time they're highly concerned about having this federal level, control of the militia. So at the same time, they said they also wanted to write in there that they should not disarm its citizenry. And so, but you have to look at it through the lens of, from being under the reign of England at the time, and what they were going with, all the taxation and all the rebellion. And so this is a completely different time. So that's how that law was written. Does it apply today is the question that we have to do. Is we're applying a legislation that was written over 200 years ago, and how it's being interpreted. But also that legislation was written and it did not apply to Black people at that time. And so the individual right to bear arms was actually not codified in the Second Amendment. It was codified in the 14th Amendment when the 14th Amendment was passed. And that's when the Supreme Court decided to codify that as an individual right to bear arms with the passage of Civil Rights Act. So, I mean, a lot of this went through the Supreme Court as well. And so it's kind of understanding where all these pieces and moving pieces came through, because that individual right to bear arms didn't really come through. And then that's when you started seeing a lot of these different regulations come through on a federal level. But it's very clear that the states have the right to regulate. And so some of what we're talking about with how do we advocate? And that's really what we're here today, is how do we make this better? Because it's completely unacceptable that our children are not safe in school. And it is completely unacceptable that our children have to deal with this question. I don't want my children dealing with it, right? And nobody wants their children to be dealing with this. But how can we make things better for our state, our citizens, and our children, right? And so we have to look at where the legislation is and how we can start moving the needle on this. And there's some very powerful lobby organizations, very powerful legislators, and we're not going to make a difference if we don't stand up and unite and actually start using our legislative voice in here. And that's really what it comes down to, is leveraging our legislative voice. And a lot of that is kind of getting back to what Art was saying, is there's a lot of people and this is kind of me putting my policy hat on, is there's a lot of people in America who are one issue voters, right? And they have their one issue that's super important to them, and that's what they'll vote on, and they'll compromise on just about everything else except for their one issue. And so how do we make this the one issue for people? This is the one issue that they're willing to plant their flag on and say, this is the one issue that I'm willing to vote on and to push. And that's really the challenge that we have. And if, seeing 19 children being killed in a school doesn't drive Texans to say, no, not again, not in Texas, this is our one issue now. I mean, this is, how do we drive people to say, this is our one issue? And that's the challenge that we have to raise to people.
A couple of people have asked in the comments, have suggested maybe we need to be more graphic. Be more graphic in getting the message out to the public. This is what is going on. We have, again, the movie image, and in the TV violence, people get shot all the time. Amazingly, they never bleed. But when somebody is actually shot, and I don't care if it's a 22 or even a BB gun, for heaven's sake, that hurts. And we talk, people who buy and sell guns talk about the importance of the biggest caliber, the best, fastest gun. But all that training, again, most of the training we do is against paper targets. And when somebody's shooting back at you, Chief, it's a lot different. And even the best, most well-meaning person doesn't always aim well under stress. And so we can talk about, we're doing it for protection, we're doing it because we want to be the good guy with the gun. But even trained personnel, not just police officers, people in the military make mistakes and have compromised aim. How do you respond to people who say, but I need this, I'm gonna save lives, I'm gonna help people?
You want me to address that?
If you don't mind.
Yeah, what's going to keep you in life, and the number one defense to and the number one thing to do to stay safe is situational awareness. It's exercising good judgment. It's not, I think, quite honestly, sometimes people get a false sense of security, and they might take risks that they might not otherwise take just because they have a firearm readily, easily accessible. And quite honestly, a lot of folks carry firearms or possess firearms that do not take the time to go train, that do not take the time to make sure they understand the laws, the rules of engagement, all these other things. And so I will say this: if you're going to have a firearm, you should be a responsible gun owner. You should train with that firearm. You should train with the firearm regularly. You should make sure you keep it safe. If you're going to go out drinking, that's not the time to have the firearm on you. If you're going to leave it in your personal vehicle, you should make sure you have it locked in a lockbox inside the vehicle that criminals can't get to. Do you remember back in the 70s, I used to come from LA to Houston to visit my cousins in Kingwood, and along 59 there, I can't tell you how many pickup trucks I would see with hunting rifles. You mentioned them earlier, Dr. I think it was Dr. Prost that mentioned it. But you know why you don't see that anymore? Because crooks are stealing guns and rifles constantly out of vehicles. So I think, if nothing else, if we all took personal responsibility, whether we're gun owners, that we'll be better off. Let me just say one other thing about these folks that go around open carrying. You know who open carries every day in this country? 800,000 police officers. And you know that the death of these police officers from gunshots is up significantly in the last few years has been trending upward. And you know who gets killed with their own firearm on a regular basis? Police officers. So if you're going to carry a firearm, you need to think about weapons retention. You need to think about the element of surprise, because these open carry folks, cops lose their firearms, get disarmed more often than people think in this country, and get killed with or wounded with their own firearm. So there's a lot that goes into these things, but at the end of the day, we owe it to our children, we owe it to our families, we owe it to our friends, we owe it to our neighbors, and we owe it to each other to do more to reduce and address the scourge of gun violence in this country that is unlike any other country on earth. And you know what makes us different? We're all part of the same race, the human race, right? If you're a person of faith, we're all God's children. Our movies that are shown here are shown all over the world. The same games are playing all over the world. The same mental health issues are all over the world. The difference is the proliferation of firearms in our country. And what we need to do is have a real discussion as to what our country should look like moving forward, and what we should do to more safely coexist and manage the Second Amendment rights with the safety and the greater good of the American people. And I think that's a discussion we need to have as a nation moving forward. All
right. Unfortunately, we're kind of coming to the end of our time allocation, and I know that I don't want to take up too much additional time. I want to thank everyone who posted questions, and there are a lot more questions now than when we started, and things that I wish we had time to address. And so I hope we'll do this again, because as Mr. Rosales, we were talking earlier that this is really needs to be the first of many discussions. We need to bring this up. And as far as the league is concerned, we do want people to know that anything that we discuss, anytime we have decisions to make in our communities, that makes it political. And your elected officials are put into office by you to represent you. And so we need to let our elected officials know that there are problems. Somebody in the question and answer said that their elected officials said there's not that many gun sales going on. Well, statistics would tell us otherwise. In fact, over the past 2 years, there have been at least, I think, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, 6 million sales of guns, and that's just registered sales, right? That were done through dealers and had background checks performed, not person to person gun sales that go on, or even illegal gun transactions that happen. So we need to let our politicians know, and maybe they're just not informed, but they need to be, just as we are educating ourselves in events like we're doing tonight. And I want to thank LULAC Texas and Mr. Rosales for being here, and Mr. Bledsoe with the NAACP, and of course our own League of Women Voters president or director here in Texas, for being a part of the conversation as well, and for introducing the whole program. So there's individual action, right, that you and I can take, and that's to encourage the safe storage of guns, like Dr. McKay mentioned, to how to get rid of guns that you don't want anymore, that you inherited, maybe that you found. There's proper ways of doing that. And also be aware of the law. You can go to DPS, to their handgun training website, and they have laws and rules that apply to everybody so that you can be a better informed citizen. Also be aware of the new passage of red flag laws and other actions that have been taking place in the new law that Congress just passed. Locally, organize with the NAACP, organize with your local LULAC chapter or chapters to form gun safety action committees. Sometimes towns and communities have those or are developing those. Inform yourself and others about gun violence, gun safety, know the statistics and the regulations. It's available. And share this with your legislatures so they'll know what's going on as well. At the state level, we can talk to the governor, ask the governor to call a special session and to take action. Nationally, be aware of how NICS works, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, how to improve reporting at the state and at the local level, and about funding for guns. And again, take advantage of your local NAACP, your local LULAC chapters, and your local League of Women Voters to get started with more discussions. And hopefully, as I said, maybe with all the comments and questions with the attendees, this will be part one of a much longer and ongoing conversation, because I think there's a lot more information we need to cover. So Dr. McKay, thank you. Dr. Temple, Chief Acevedo, thank you very much for your comments, and hopefully we'll be visiting with you again. Anything else that you would like to say to wrap things up?
I'll just say thank you so much for having me, and really going back to something Dr. McKay said earlier, we know how to prevent gun violence, and it is going to take investment. It's going to be expensive, but we know how to do it, and so let's get those funds out there as well.
And I would just ask this, Art, thank you for having me, and thanks to all the panelists, but most importantly, the attendees. I would say lift your voice, raise your voice, speak out, because for everyone else, you are the other guy. Don't think because it's only happening to the other guy that someday it's not going to visit you and your family. And don't wait to lift your voice until someone in your family is killed or seriously wounded, because sooner or later it's going to touch us all. Thank you all.
Rudy, Gary, Joyce, any closing comments before we let everybody go?
Thank you all very much. It was outstanding and really very informative, and I agree with you 100%. We need to do this again.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. This is a very emotional subject, and I apologize for getting a little emotional on this situation. I just got back from Uvalde on Sunday, and I met with the actual victims' families. So it was a little close, got a little close to me over there in Uvalde, and I just want to say, the fact that we're having the discussion, whether we agree to disagree in deference to the Second Amendment and what it actually reads, and the 14th Amendment, et cetera, I'm glad we're at least having these conversations. And I thank the League of Women Voters. I thank the NAACP. I thank the Chief. I thank Dr. McKay. I thank all of you guys for, thank you, Jean. I mean, the discussions need to start somewhere.
And thanks for bringing this together, for an opportunity to share our evidence, our knowledge, and our power, and also the stories of our patients, our children, and our community, because it's the stories that are going to change. I don't really, while I like to think that I'm a physician scientist, I've learned that evidence doesn't necessarily always change the hearts and minds of our decision makers, but it's the stories that do. And we've got to keep bringing those stories forward. So thank you, Rudy, for bringing the stories. And we have to keep bringing the stories of Uvalde forward, because we can't let their story stop today. We can't let them be forgotten.
All right, anybody else? Amy and Grace, thank you very much for helping with this and putting it together. And thank you for joining with us and sticking with us tonight for this important discussion. And hopefully we'll be able to do it again very soon. Thank you and have a good evening.